Hello and welcome back to another episode of Dark Souls Dissected. For today's video, I wanted to take a closer look at the invisible walls of Dark Souls 1. In visualizing them, we can learn about some of the more subtle design considerations that went into making their environments. Where they were afraid of players attempting to get out of bounds, what kinds of shortcuts they didn't want you to make, as well as some other features and bugs you might have never noticed. There's some surprising stuff in here. I'll start by talking a little bit about the different kinds of environmental collisions and how it all works, and then I'm going to follow that up with a tour through all the different levels to share everything I've found. We'll also take a closer look at a few locations that have notorious collision in general, whether or not they fully count as invisible walls. But before we get started, I do want to give a quick flashing lights warning. In toggling the collision to display, the way it overlaps with the visible environment can often create this horrible flickering or blinking effect, and I'm going to show what this can look like at its worst in a couple seconds. Now, in the interest of making a video that isn't a complete eyesore to watch, I'm going to do my best to avoid this. I'll be pausing the footage when necessary, finding angles where the flickering isn't so severe, or disabling the map so that doesn't happen. So while it should never be half as bad as what you just saw, this will happen to a lesser degree throughout the entire video. It's hard to draw a line on what deserves a warning and what doesn't, so I just want to say from the start that there won't be additional warnings and that you should only proceed with caution if you're sensitive to this sort of thing. With that being said, let's get started. Dark Souls has its map pieces divided into different chunks, or set pieces, throughout any given area, and the collision data is no different. Most of the collision is tied to these different set pieces, and to give you a frame of reference for how broken down this is, a level like Sen's Fortress has 66 different sets of environmental collision, and this is what just one of them looks like. Each set of collisions is actually made up of two different kinds. There's high hit collision and low hit collision, sometimes referred to more simply as high or low collision. They both occupy the same space, but they each have their own purpose. By default, the display in debug here shows high collision in green and low collision in yellow. High collision tends to match the visual geometry of the environment in a way that's more one-to-one. It's not always perfect, but it often matches what you're looking at fairly well. Low collision, on the other hand, is a lot more simplified. Where you previously had high collision that matched the shape of each individual step on a staircase, with low collision that's going to look more like a ramp. Or for example, something like a pile of rubble might lose all of its detail and just get one bigger box of low collision around it. What I find interesting about the difference between these is that it's only the low collision that our player directly interacts with. To be able to stand on a piece of ground and not fall through the map, it's the low collision that keeps us in place. For something like a wall or a railing to stop us in our tracks, it's the low collision that we walk into and get stuck on. Low collision is also where more hands-on adjustments to the collision data seem to be made. While it's generally bigger and blockier than high collision, it's also where you'll find bespoke invisible walls, stuff that clearly didn't derive from just the visual environment itself. You'll find these pieces that were handcrafted by the developers for a specific purpose. So what is the high collision used for? It's used for two different things: projectiles and inverse kinematics. Let's start with projectiles. At first, it might seem funny to have this kind of redundancy, two different kinds of environmental collision that overlap, but it does make sense. In order to not get stuck in weird places, having low collision to prevent you from entering a space is very helpful. You want simpler geometry that helps avoid walking into the middle of all these routes and maybe getting stuck in a weird way. But then invoking a different kind of collision, one that is often more one-to-one with the visual geometry, is helpful for something like projectiles, where blockier collision would mean hitting invisible walls with your arrows and spells a lot more often, which would be very annoying. Though if you've played this game a good amount, especially with an archer build, you're probably thinking, but my arrows do hit invisible walls pretty frequently. And yeah, I didn't say the system was perfect, mind you, but you can see what they were going for, and the problem would be a lot worse than it currently is if we didn't have these different kinds of collision. While the high collision usually matches the environment pretty well, sometimes you'll get things like small windows or railings with iron bars that are still just a solid block behind the scenes, and so your arrows won't pass through. The game also just has some mistakes and oversights in it. Shocking, I know. Take this spot in the Painted World. If you try firing an arrow through this space here, you might find it impacting nothing and then floating in midair. I think most people would assume that it's because the environmental collision is a lot blockier than what we see here, but that's not actually the problem. Most of the high collision matches the exact size and shape of stuff like these wooden boards, at least in this area, pretty accurately. It just so happens to be misaligned here. It's not that it was too big and broad, it's simply in the wrong spot. So what this means is that our arrow will fire through the wooden board over here that we do see just fine. TKGP informed me of a pretty egregious example in Firelink Shrine. One that, to be fair, has probably never negatively impacted gameplay, because what are the odds this would matter for the average player? But there's an entire chunk here that's missing high collision. While the low collision is still there and obstructs the player from walking through this wall just fine, it means we can throw projectiles through it completely unobstructed. I think major issues with high collision in this game are pretty rare overall, but if in my tour through the different levels I don't cover curious spots where your projectiles were hitting invisible walls, please let me know in the comments below. I'll be happy to answer any questions and provide screenshots of anything you're wondering about. Now, the other main purpose of the high hit collision is that it's used for inverse kinematics. If you're not familiar with what this is, it's what tells the game how the bones of a character's body should be posed, based on what some endpoint is interacting with. For example, in this side-by-side comparison, the player is standing in the exact same idling animation. It would be virtually impossible to make it so that you have a unique, pre-made pose for every different position your feet can wind up in. Instead, both players seen here are being told to run the exact same idling animation. There's no difference at all. The only difference is that the inverse kinematics recognize that the player's foot is on top of a step, so it automatically bends the character's legs and ankles accordingly. It should be obvious why high-hit collisions are used for this purpose. When the low collision is blockier and doesn't match the environment as well, you want the more accurate collision to recognize details like when your foot is on top of a brick. However, it's still pretty interesting to me because of what I said earlier. The player really only interacts with and is only ever obstructed by low collision. So am I saying that you do and don't interact with high collisions at the same time? Yes. Let's head over to the Sunlight Altar to make better sense of this. If we go out of bounds behind the Sunlight Altar, we'll find a patch of railing here that only had high collision set for it. This means it doesn't obstruct our movement, we can walk right through it. And if we try dropping on top of it, we'll fall right through it as well. This is what I mean when I say that we don't interact with high collisions. However, if we position ourselves so that we're floating a little below the height of the railing, trying to walk through it will raise our character a bit. It looks like he's standing on it. Again, he's not truly standing on it. The moment we re-enable gravity, we're going to fall right through the railing again. But the inverse kinematic system recognizes the high collision, and will make subtle adjustments to the placement and pose of our character. And it's not just for lifting our character, it can do the opposite. Here's an example from the Undead Asylum. We have these rubble piles that are covered in these wider bubbles of low collision. Since low collision is what we actually stand on, you might expect then that we'd walk over this rubble pile and essentially float above it. But that doesn't happen. Our legs will clip through the low collision and it'll look like we're sinking through. But we haven't completely fallen through the low collision or anything, it's still supporting us and holding us up. It's just that, with high collision nearby enough to our feet beneath us, the game is able to recognize and prioritize it. And that's what tells us to sink through a little to get these more accurate poses. This is fundamentally how staircases work. The low collision will typically be a smooth ramp that covers the whole thing, but the high collision will mark the shape of the individual steps for us. Now that we've covered the basics, I should mention that there's a whole variety of parameters that can potentially be applied to the collisions as well. I'll throw a list up on the screen, but something like when the vertical death camera gets enabled is a result of passing through a plane of collision that has that specific purpose. And while I could review stuff like kill boxes, since all of that stuff is just collision data as well, I'll probably save that for a future video. The purpose of today's video is, more specifically, to review the pieces of collision that obstruct your movement, to tease out where and why the developers implemented invisible walls, and also the places where they might have forgotten and made some mistakes. Let us embark on our journey by starting at the beginning, the Northern Undead Asylum. After we get our weapon and emerge in this area, we have an open view to the first bonfire below. However, this was completely walled off by the developers. No matter how high you can't get over this railing, because a giant wall of low-hit collision was placed here. Now, even if they hadn't put this here and simply made the collision match the exact shape of the railing, I'm confident that it'd be tall enough on its own to prevent jumping over it in the first place. Remember that, unlike Elden Ring, jumps in Dark Souls are more for clearing horizontal gaps and don't provide much upwards movement. However, it's easy to see why From Software went a bit overboard here and walled it off completely. If we were to jump over this railing before having opened the shortcut door below, and I'll show what that looks like by using debug to no-clip through the collision, it would let us back into the boss room when this door should be locked. Now we can defeat the boss without talking to Oscar, and we would miss getting the Estus Flask. This is a glitch known as the Estus Skip, which isn't normally done by clipping through the map like this at all, but what this means is that jumping over the railing would have been another way to pull that off. We can see that From Software didn't want to take any chances and decided to just completely cover this opening instead. It didn't have to be this tall, but no one will notice it's there, and so it certainly didn't hurt to be a little extra cautious here. Remember that this is just low collision blocking this, not high collision, so using stuff like projectiles wouldn't inform you that this is even here. Around the corner, we have an early tease for the rusted iron ring. What they did to protect it from being obtained early is pretty interesting. While I just said that jumping isn't really for providing upwards movement in the Souls games, there is an exploitable circumstance where running and jumping against a sloped surface can sometimes provide a lot more upwards movement than you would expect. To prevent that from being possible here, they made an interesting choice. They didn't just wall this off with one big invisible wall, otherwise we'd be trapped in this staircase when coming from the other direction and wouldn't be able to just walk off of it. As we can see, it's not protected like that. I can freely walk back and forth when I'm using debug to float. Instead, they just gave a really sharp edge to the bottom step that sticks out a little further than what we can normally see. It's a clever choice for obstructing our movement, one that contrasts to the other one we just looked at, where a more minimal and delicate approach was taken. Unsurprisingly, this outside area is completely walled in as well. While escaping here early wouldn't softlock the game, it would be weird to escape the Asylum early without defeating the boss. That would mean that, when we return, we would be locked out of the Asylum because we never opened this door or got the key to it in the first place. Plus it doesn't even have an interaction prompt from this side. So aside from trading with the bird, we'd miss out on everything the return trip allows, from the rusted iron ring to being able to get into the painted world. We can see that they also included a patch of wall over here as well. It protects this empty space between the hallway leading to here and the actual boss arena. If we could wind up down there, we might fall out of the map or get stuck somewhere weird, depending on where we land. Outside the exit of the Asylum, if we turn right, we'll find another invisible wall around the corner of the building, but we won't find one on the opposite side. And this is a good lesson on when it just organically makes sense to include invisible walls or not, depending on arbitrary design elements of the nearby out-of-bounds terrain and how close we can get to it. On the side that we find the wall, we have a patch of ground out of reach that's fairly close to us, and some players might get curious about trying to get there. Compare this to the other corner, it doesn't look like there's anywhere nearby that we might be able to make it to, in addition to having this negative space here. This conveys much more strongly an inability to go back here because you're not remotely close to anything that looks safe, so the developers didn't feel a need to bother with an invisible wall on this side. One last thing I'd like to show here before moving on is these giant floating planes of collision above the exit of the level. I'm not going to stop to point out where they occur in every level they're in.
That would be a waste of time.
It's something I already talked about in my Out of Bounds exploration video if you'd like to know more, but I didn't show these ones in particular and figured I might as well mention it here. In every area that has a cutscene, there's going to be some extra piece of collision floating somewhere. The way the game decides what to render is based on what you're currently standing on or making contact with. This is why if I set foot down in a level, but then fly a good distance without touching the ground again, the map won't update and you'll see parts of it missing. It's the piece of collision that you're currently making contact with that tells you what parts of your surrounding world are supposed to render. Cutscenes operate on the same logic. Even if you see yourself in the cutscene, the game is virtually touching one of these weird pieces of collision and using their instructions on what to render. In theory, it wouldn't be strictly necessary to always have some random floating plane of collision for cutscenes, because the normal ground nearby to where the cutscene triggers may already have all the necessary stuff for the cutscene already present. But it is handy for the developers to have these customized patches of ground that give them more control during their cutscenes. The part that's funny to me is that they really are here in a physical sense. If you know where to find them and use outside tools to fly, you can go right up to them and land on them. And you'll see what's loaded to display get swapped out in real time. This first one apparently loads Firelink Shrine, important for the second half of the cutscene. And the second one just includes the tip of the cliff here for when the bird first picks us up, showing how they took advantage of the system to render less assets, because when we're normally standing here, the building and everything behind us would be included as well. Now let's move on to Firelink Shrine. There's a lot less to talk about here overall, but there is one thing here I find fascinating. To start with, it's a lot more open compared to the previous area for obvious reasons. We're not going to get soft-locked or majorly screw up our progression if things aren't more blocked off. While the Asylum was trying to carefully funnel us through a tight area, here's where the game expands into something like an open playground. There's lots of little nooks and different paths to find here, and so there's no point in restricting your movement. You can wind up in some weird places, sure, but this generally doesn't get you into any trouble. The end result is a lack of invisible walls, with the low hit collision being a lot closer to the high collision than it usually is in a lot of other areas, ignoring that one weird mistake I showed earlier.
You sorry fool.
However, I wonder if they might have wanted to restrict our movements a little more than they did. With some careful parkour, you can find a path back to the Undead Asylum without ever leaving Firelink Shrine, when they almost certainly intended for you to unlock the shortcut from the Undead Parish first. With more foresight, I feel like they probably would have wanted to include a little jagged edge here, like the one found by the Rusted Iron Ring, to prevent you from getting up. However, besides being underleveled and perhaps a little unprepared if you go back to the Undead Asylum earlier than intended, there's nothing inherently game-breaking or problematic about it. So it's just one of those things that I'm assuming is unintentional, but once it was discovered, they were probably okay with it and didn't feel like it needed to be patched out. Now, here's the interesting part. I discovered a change that's unique to Dark Souls Remastered. Near the jump to the return path to the Asylum, there's this out-of-bounds patch of ground over here. It's not protected by a hidden wall in the Prepare to Die edition, but it is in the remaster. On its own, I think it already makes for a neat bit of trivia, an obscure difference between the two versions of the games that probably no one knew about. But things get weirder when we take a look at how it was implemented. This isn't just a normal patch of invisible wall like we'd expect. It's an entire duplicate of the elevator shaft to the Undead Parish, or at least the upper half of it. And it has some incredibly weird behaviors. If you fly to get on top of it, it makes your character invisible and unable to move, and sort of soft locks the game. I mean, I guess it's not really a soft lock, you can just quit to get out of there, but it's obviously still very glitchy and takes the controls away from you in an unexpected way. I wondered if this was a mistake. Maybe the developers of the remaster were tweaking and experimenting with some obscure issue relating to the elevator shaft, and simply forgot they misplaced this duplicate test version they cast aside over here. But I think this probably was intentional. When we remember that the remaster was made by Qlock and not From Software, it seems pretty likely that they didn't have access to all of the same tools, and editing the map data of these games has always been notoriously difficult. It took over 10 years for the community to come up with a Blender plugin for modifying the maps, something that was no small task. Getting up to this spot was a potential issue, as the collision didn't extend further out here, and so getting up here meant being able to fall out of the map in a glitchy looking way. Qlock probably did want to make that impossible, and if they lacked robust tools for editing the map easily, simply copying and changing the coordinates of an existing piece of collision was probably the easiest solution. It looks really janky when we see what's happening behind the scenes, but this is completely fine. When we bear in mind that we can't see what it looks like, and that it's normally impossible to get on top of it and turn invisible, in the end, it just functions as a completely regular invisible wall. I'd even go so far as to say that it's a good one. An ideal invisible wall is one that prevents you from going somewhere that you shouldn't be able to, but isn't so obvious that it brings attention to itself. When you miss this jump because of the invisible elevator shaft in the remaster, it kind of feels like you just missed the jump, and you probably assume that the ledge is just too steep. So while it was a very hacky solution that looks pretty funny, the end result is perfectly fine. Well executed, even. Moving into the Undead Burg, we'll find that this is the area that probably had the most hands-on adjustments for implementing invisible walls. Most of the level runs above and parallel to the lower Undead Burg below, and it's close enough to be a survivable fall in multiple places. And since you're not supposed to be able to get to the lower Burg right away, they implemented all sorts of protections trying to prevent that from happening. Stairs are a good means to clear a railing you can't normally jump over, because of course, you can use the staircase to jump from higher up. This is why it's a standard practice throughout the Undead Burg to protect every railing near a staircase or ramp with an invisible wall that extends a little higher. We'll find this on the walkway leading to the Undead Merchant, we'll find this on the staircase by the door that the hollow kicks open, and we'll find this on the rooftop leading to the firebomb hollows here. If this one wasn't here, it would have been very easy to get to the lower Undead Burg early. Once again, I'm going to use debug to clip through the wall, and it reveals a shortcut that would have looked like this. There is also one more protected railing by a staircase, but it's a bit funnier. It's this one here, but it wound up being the sloppiest one of them. The others work just fine, but this one doesn't help prevent shortcuts, it only helps prevent falling out of the map and dying. But it doesn't do a good enough job at it, because we can still clear it by jumping from here. And to make matters worse, they didn't adequately protect this area with kill planes. The black sheets you see here are the kill boxes for falling out of the map, and there is a gap. So without anything to kill us here, and no solid ground to die on from fall damage, we're just gonna keep falling, and it'll take a full 30 seconds to die, all while seeing parts of the map we're not supposed to. Oops. The other funny aspect is that now that we know it's here, we can try landing on it on purpose with a carefully timed plunge attack. While going here doesn't accomplish anything, you could leave a message here, and now everyone's going to see a floating message in a weird place. Which, if you ever decide to do this, consider leaving a message that says illusory wall, to let everyone know who sent you. The one staircase railing they forgot to protect, unsurprisingly, opens up an unintended shortcut. This would be by far the most difficult and inconvenient of the shortcuts to pull off. There are easier ones I'll get to in a minute, but you could take advantage of this to get onto this railing. Once you're here, the fall damage is too high to normally survive, but there's a few glitches available for surviving lethal falls, and I'll link to their explanations in the video description. But yeah, you can see why they were right to be so on guard about this overall. I don't know if this particular shortcut was already known by others, but I found it myself in making this video. I think it says something about the importance of these invisible walls when literally the first inconsistency I spotted opened the game up to some exploitation. There's also other invisible walls sprinkled throughout the Undead Burg that aren't just your typical railing extensions. Behind the breakable barrels, we have this set of invisible walls here. I guess this is sort of still like a railing extension as well. It is extending above the railings below, but I think it's noteworthy for having to be a lot taller than the others. They also went out of their way to make this extra little flap here to ensure that we couldn't hug and aim to the right on our way down. This rooftop here was also given protection. Walls ensure we can't climb any of the rubble here, and there's also this giant flap over here preventing us from trying to jump onto or around this nearby roof. If this wasn't here, we might have been able to do something like this. The railings down by the Undead Merchant were made taller as well. I don't think these actually serve a purpose, and unlike the other railings, these aren't near anything higher up that you could use to try and jump over them. These walls are already a little taller than the ones we find up above, and these ones above don't have invisible walls helping them, and you can't jump over them anyways. So I don't think adding invisible walls here helped prevent jumping over them in any way, but the developers probably thought better safe than sorry. If it wasn't made for the player in the first place, maybe instead, they were more worried about some kind of attack launching the Undead Merchant off of this platform. Although I don't think that would have been possible regardless. And you wouldn't have to be worried about losing his item drop down there, that's protected by quitting and reloading. I've made another video that explores in detail when quitting and reloading gets items back if you'd like to know more. Over by the blue Tearstone ring, we have this opening on this walkway that you can use to get down there early. If you look below, you find this weird out-of-bounds pit of water immediately beneath us. But beyond the buildings surrounding this pit lies the streets of the lower Undead Burg. So if we could just jump over one of those rooftops below, we might be good. But instead, this'll happen every time. This is because they put a very tall set of invisible walls that prevent you from making it over the building below, funneling you into the water pit. If you ever wondered if rolling to the blue Tearstone ring from here was intentional, I'd say it clearly was. They wanted to tempt you with a risky jump, but allowing it in the first place meant blocking off other directions. At the base of the unprotected staircase where I found that shortcut, there's a funny little extra flap here used to block this empty space. So this one wasn't about trying to deter shortcuts at all, but it's just something they occasionally do with cramped spaces to maybe avoid any awkwardness that might arise from trying to squeeze in there. Here we have this broken walkway leading to an inaccessible area. If you ever tried to make this jump, I regret to inform you that your efforts were in vain. Even if you could make it that far, it's blocked off with an invisible wall, on top of there not being anything back there anyways. Now we're at the Taurus Demon. Despite being a notoriously open space, as getting the boss to fall to its death is a well-known occurrence, they did put some invisible walls here. Aside from the 3 spots that are clearly wide open, any section of the wall that is halfway broken down has taller walls extending above them. If you or the boss are going to fall out of the arena here, they wanted it to only happen in just one of a few specific locations. Even this third open section at the very end probably has taller walls than you're expecting. You couldn't jump over this on your own even if you wanted, or at least it's very difficult. Thankfully the Taurus Demon's backstep jump gets enough lift to be able to clear it though. And lastly, over by Solaire, I found that they didn't protect the railings here. There is not a bound spot you can land on because of this. Perhaps this is another candidate for somewhere you could leave an illusory wall message if you want to join in on adding messages in weird places. Before we move on to the Undead Parish, I mentioned that there are other unintended shortcuts to the lower Undead Burg that managed to slip in. So let's take a quick look at those and try to unpack why they're probably still in the game. Though they tried blocking off jumping from this rooftop, they failed to anticipate landing on this ledge below. which from here, we can easily do a running jump from. Despite the invisible walls they put over behind the breakable barrels, they didn't put anything behind them that extends out further. So it was figured out that if you can find a way to get on top of this railing, that you can pretty easily do this, which evolved into this. And lastly, we have this spot here, which looks pretty well protected, but climbing the ladder and then immediately moving in that direction allows us to slip past it. From here, there's a few risky jumps we could do to get closer to the Capra Demon right away, but instead we can just go in this direction and open up the Aqueduct shortcut. While I think it took a pretty decent number of years to find all of these shortcuts, the first of these three was found pretty early on in the game's lifespan. It could have been patched out at any point, so why wasn't it? I think it's safe to say that, with all of the other invisible walls we find here, that they didn't want you doing this. But once it was discovered, they probably shrugged it off. Even assuming a situation where patching the game somehow didn't cost From Software any money, or didn't take any effort from QLock to fix, they were okay with a few unintended skips being discovered in the end. The first reason is that the vast majority of players would never find this on their own, so it just being a niche strategy for those already familiar with the game just wasn't a big deal. The second reason is that it's especially not a big deal when we factor in gameplay progression. Earlier I said that we're not supposed to be able to get into the lower Undead Burg right away, but that's assuming we're talking about playing through the Undead Burg normally in the first place. There's nothing stopping us from starting with the Master Key, going straight to the Valley of Drakes, coming up through the Darkroot Basin, going backwards through the Undead Parish, grabbing the key to the lower Undead Burg, and then just letting ourselves in normally. It requires some very unusual routing, sure, but completely without glitches or unintended skips, there's nothing stopping us from having the Capra Demon being the first boss we fight after leaving the Asylum, thanks to the first half of Dark Souls being incredibly non-linear. So when we factor in that the lower Undead Burg could be the first level that we play for real, albeit having had to run through a few areas to get here, it really doesn't hurt anything for players to do this. The biggest point of friction stems from what happens when players do shortcuts during multiplayer, which cuts players off from each other or disconnects them the moment they wander off too far. That's one reason this probably shouldn't be allowed, but who's actually going to take the time to mess with that? Onto the Undead Parish. Over by the Sunlight Altar, we find more railing protection here. At first this seems incredibly unnecessary, as there's no reason to not let you jump over here. But they were probably more concerned with getting up onto the railing rather than over it, because once you're on it, you could go back and get stuck behind pieces of the broken statue. I'm also reminded of how the entrance to the depths used to be behind the Sunlight Altar. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, just look at the distant view from the Undead Burg, which has a low poly representation of what used to be here. You would be able to drop in through this roof and wind up here. I'll link to a video by Samuel Diamond that provides a lot more evidence. Who knows if that would have been removed before they started tweaking these invisible walls, but it seems possible to me that controlling how you access that rooftop might have also been a consideration. Up on the Black Knight's tower, we have a few things going on. This opening on the left here has a vertical wall, preventing you from trying to use it as a ramp. They didn't want you to try landing on this rooftop, which lacks collision and would have been a problem. Additionally, everything you see here is protected by invisible walls. Behind this cart, we find a door that's slightly ajar, blocked by rubble behind it. Unsurprisingly, it's entirely covered with a completely flat sheet of collision, so there was never any hope of nudging your way in even a little bit. But if you're curious what kind of space is back there, here's a quick look. In this corridor here, some windows are covered up completely, while others aren't. Of all the invisible walls I've shown so far, these seem to have the least logic or reason to them. They wouldn't have led anywhere inappropriate, and I don't think you would have been able to jump high enough to get through them anyways. And moving up to the church rooftop, we finally see something a bit different. Blue walls. Obviously, these don't keep you from falling off the roof. I think everyone knows you can fall off of it, but they're not here for us. They're here for the boss. I'm going to refer to these as enemy walls. It's not uncommon in these games for bosses to be protected from falling outside of their arena. It's not just AI keeping them away from these ledges. Even if you took control of a gargoyle and tried making it walk off of the roof, it won't be able to. That's handled by adding collision that has a property that tells it that it's for enemies only. People sometimes wonder if something like the Taurus demon being able to fall to its death was intentional, and it absolutely was. It's why they created these openings, and why they didn't protect them with enemy walls. If you're thinking, maybe there's a chance they simply forgot to include them here, I believe that's incredibly unlikely. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that all of the collisions are broken down into different chunks, usually corresponding with different specific set pieces of the map. For example, the collision we see here will only be for this part of the level. It's not going to include some planes of collision for somewhere else on the complete opposite side of the level, because why would it? Dividing things this way is just the natural result of breaking the levels down into different chunks and having collisions for that particular part of the map. But not all collisions were handled this way, because sometimes the developers needed to go in afterwards and fix a few things. This is where you can sometimes find some collision that isn't tied to a particular set piece. That's exactly what we're looking at here. These enemy walls aren't a collision inherent to the church rooftop. It's its own standalone thing that was added to the entire map in bulk. When we toggle it to display, we'll see that it also includes the Hellkite Bridge. Slightly taller walls trying to help prevent the dragon from falling to its death. This is what the workflow probably looked like for this kind of collision. They'd go back through a level and look at all the places they needed to patch up. The Undead Burg is technically the same map as the Undead Parish, and so it just seems incredibly hard to believe that they thought to put slightly taller walls on the Hellkite Bridge, but would have forgotten about the first major boss of the game, right nearby over here. So, this was not a mistake. I should also add that this kind of enemy collision blankets every area transition, since the game wasn't designed to handle loading enemies in areas they don't belong in, so keeping them out from following you was important, otherwise you'd be able to watch them disappear right in front of you. Sometimes that's handled by the enemy AI on its own, with leash points that prevent them from following you too far. But these invisible walls provide a hard block as a backup, and also for the times they didn't bother leashing them hard enough. But there are some places where they forgot to include this. The elevator to the Undead Parish wasn't protected in the same way, so you can watch enemies chasing after you get teleported back to their spawn location. They did include one of these walls for the Titanite demon, and it's a little further into the room than I realized. This means you have the space here that it can't get to. But he's got a long weapon and ranged attacks, so this isn't really something that can be used to your advantage. In the lower Undead Burg, we find some invisible walls right away that weren't handled as well as they could have been. The staircase heading in was given some protection. It makes sense that they'd rather prevent you from jumping over it and exploring back there, as the water pit was already surrounded by an invisible wall because of this jump from earlier. So at this point, letting the player just fall into the water and die was no longer an option. But they didn't make these railing extensions tall enough or slippery on top, so you can still jump onto them. This means it's possible to fall back here and get stuck. It's also another opportunity to leave a floating message in a weird place, so consider trying that here too if you feel like messing around. We can also see that this well is completely covered, so you are never at risk of falling in. And even if you could, its depth is faked with a dark texture. There's really not much else to see here. Every tantalizing dead end that looks like it could have led somewhere is covered with a completely solid wall. And as much as some of you found getting pummeled in a corner in the Capra Demon's room annoying, developers made some effort so you at least wouldn't get stuck in weird places, not without enemies directly blocking you in a valid corner, at least. They completely walled off the empty space behind this tree, so you couldn't wind up behind it. It's a bit difficult to see clearly in-game, but they wrapped the trees with these sorts of tubes, and then also the ground behind it has this extra invisible wall that extends further out from the archway. This extra wall was actually constructed as a big rectangular box, meaning you can stand on top of it as well. This was done to prevent you from falling in from above, which is also helpful when backing away from enemies that follow you up the staircase, as it means you don't have to round this corner in a perfect L shape. You can cut across this corner and avoid falling. In the depths, unexpectedly, the high collision for the iron bars is mostly one-to-one with the visible geometry, which means it is possible to shoot arrows between them. This will probably come as a surprise to most people who've tried and failed, but it is possible. The biggest issue is that the hitbox for your arrowhead is wide enough to still impact a bar even when it seems like it should have fit through. But this doesn't mean it's impossible. There's also some bars that don't bend into the exact same position that you see, so a few of the empty spaces are protected in a kind of clumsy way, but you can just pick a different spot to try shooting through and it should eventually work. As far as invisible walls go, we have something kind of funny at the start of the level. I don't think this was intentional, but these archways are covered up. That's probably the result of choosing the simplest, low-poly, corresponding shape, turning the arches into rectangles. Because there's no obvious reason why they would want these here, they don't protect you from doing anything weird, and the opposite is true. This means that you can jump off the stairs and watch yourself collide with nothing. On the walkway with the channeler and the rats, the corner of this railing is extended a bit higher. The regular height of the railing is already tall enough to prevent jumping over it. However, you can tell that they were concerned about this floor to the right being higher up and what attempting to jump from there might allow. Going against my expectations, all these little nooks near the entrance to the Gaping Dragon aren't protected by invisible walls. It's just that the collision of these columns is a bit wider than you might expect, and you're simply too big to fit through these spaces even without a solid wall blocking them. The Gaping Dragon is also protected from being able to fall out of its arena, once again with collision that's only for the enemies. There's a space here that looks a little uncomfortably open, but the dragon is large enough for that to not be an issue. By the upper bonfire in Blighttown, invisible walls protect exploring around the sides of these pillars, and I got trolled pretty good here once. Someone left a message saying item ahead, and I knew it was a troll message because I already knew the game pretty well at that point, but nonetheless, it still made me curious if getting back there was possible at all, like maybe just as a weird out-of-bounds spot to get to. And so I died probably over a dozen times trying to make this jump. At least I was next to a bonfire. In Quelaag's arena, an extra set of invisible walls not inherent to the original set pieces here was added afterwards by the developers. It keeps you off of the railing on the staircase, and it completely covers this weird pit area that's off to the side. More importantly, it covers the sides of the arena, preventing you from getting up onto any weird spots. Or at least, that seems to have been the intention, but the one spot along this wall that they didn't bother covering became known as a spot that you can get up to and cheese the fight from. So it's another example of what can happen here when they let up and aren't as aggressive with the invisible walls as they probably should be. This same set of collisions also includes walls that prevent us from getting too high up around the entrance mound to Quelaag's domain. It also prevents us from getting around this column by the entrance to the Great Hollow. And otherwise, it mostly just blocks off some rubble piles that they didn't want you climbing. To go on a quick tangent away from the kinds of walls this video is primarily focusing on, while we're in Blighttown, I can't pass the opportunity to examine some of the janky collision that it's known for. Some of the boards you walk on have their gaps filled in, so you can sometimes stand in some pretty risky looking places that turn out to be safe. A particularly wild one is this ledge near the jump to the Iaito, which, I guess you could freak out some friends in co-op with this one cool trick.
I mean, basically, can people levitate?
Can people levitate?
Oh, I knew I shouldn't have asked.
We can also take a closer look at the swaying bridges and why they sometimes awkwardly nudge us off. In most places on top of them, when you stand still, you'll at least sway back and forth with the bridge and there won't be any problems. However, sometimes you don't, and it's this inconsistency that can make crossing them feel a little unpredictable. This is mostly only an issue on this longer swaying bridge here, and we can see why. Each segment of this bridge has its own collision box, and it's the way they overlap that sometimes competes for what you're actually standing on. This large piece off to the side pokes through, and it can essentially yank you off to the side in a way that's visually unintuitive. Or you'll have something like this board here not moving much, so when you're expecting to sway with the bridge and you don't, that can throw you off. Moving a little bit onto the next segment is the only spot I could find where standing completely still when it starts swaying can get you killed, probably due to its proximity to the still board behind it. So I'd assume this exact spot here is responsible for the vast majority of deaths caused by this thing. Let's also take a look at this really annoying branch. I'm sure many of you have experienced slipping off of it when trying to cross, and I would blame this on its collision being too detailed. When we compare the high collision and low collision here, we find that they're exactly the same. And that's a problem, because low collision is usually supposed to be simpler. It's the thing that makes the environment easier to traverse than high collision would be. so seeing them not be any different speaks to a lack of polish that ideally would have gone into this. The original geometry that we see visually, which the low collision matches a bit too well, is harsher than might be initially obvious. When we use free cam to take a closer look, we can see how steep this really is. But from a normal camera angle, it looks pretty well rounded, and it isn't as clear that there's a line that marks where you'd slip off of if you cross it. The middle of the platform has one spot that's a little more generous, but really most of this thing should have had flat and visible boards covering it, which is probably how a later Souls game would have handled it. If you're concerned that it might look weird to cross smoother invisible boards that don't match the visual geometry that well, that should be perfectly fine. Remember that the high collision is what dictates how inverse kinematics works and where your feet will be planted visually. So you could still appear to be walking along something with rounded edges when the platform supporting you could be something totally flat. And before we move on, although I wasn't planning on exploring kill planes very much in this video, I would be remiss to not quickly mention what's gotta be the worst one in the game. There's this notorious spot when you're nearing the bottom of the descent from Upper Blighttown, where you can die by simply walking behind these breakable pots. I've mentioned it in a previous video, but I have to show it again now with the collision visualized. Incredible stuff. Do you know of any other places in any of the Souls games where this can happen without actually falling or going out of bounds somewhere? It's the only one I can think of, but if you know of any others, I would love to know about them. Despite being mostly open and letting you fall to your death wherever, there's a few specific invisible walls on the way down in the Great Hollow. At this particular spot here, the empty space underneath this branch is closed off. At first I was wondering why they wouldn't let you just fall, since you can easily go around it, but stepping onto this branch in a weird way can get you kind of stuck, probably having something to do with the sort of jagged T-shape of its collision. When I modded the map to delete this invisible wall, I found the same issue going underneath. I was able to get back out by jumping each time I tried, but still, it's obvious why they opted to just cover this up. Similarly, there's another branch shortly below that's blocked with a wall. It doesn't stop you entirely from going around it, you just have to hug the edge in an awkward way. I assumed this was also to prevent you from getting stuck, but in deleting the collision, I didn't have any problems here. Maybe they didn't like how it looked having your head clip through this branch, but in the end, I prefer being able to just walk through this spot unimpeded. I think an invisible wall is more distracting. That's something you have to fight with when you encounter it, compared to having your head clip through the branch where that really only looks funny if you go out of your way to stand in the worst spot possible. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering about this notorious spot, but for the uninitiated, players who go down to Ash Lake without the ability to warp out yet have to climb back out of the Great Hollow on foot, where they're inevitably going to run into this disaster. Falling from here is guaranteed death, so the stakes are high when players are just trying to get out of here. Once you know the solution, it's not bad at all. Just walking forward while veering to the left seems to get you to safety every single time. But this is incredibly unintuitive. It really feels like you should fall from here, so it's not going to be easy for most players to figure out. A lot of people will try doing a running jump or rolling up the branch, and while it is possible, it's a lot harder than it looks, and a lot more dangerous than the hugging left method. When we switch to the collision view, it's easy to see why we get stuck. There's a really tall, flat ledge here. There should have been a little hidden ramp here, then there wouldn't have been a problem. This reveals the reason why staircases are always secretly ramps in their low collision, because having ramps instead of tall jagged steps is really important for traversability. As for why walking to the left works, even with the collision displayed, it's not immediately obvious why it works. These bits of collision here are ridiculously steep. You typically slip off of surfaces that are less steep than this, so at first it doesn't make any sense. But I'm pretty certain the reason we're supported is probably because of these planes of collision down here. While they're even steeper, I think the difference is that we're able to stand on top of their edges, essentially. Because you can be supported by paper-thin sheets of collision if you can get on top of an edge like this. The developers would have to otherwise go out of their way to make it slippery on purpose. So despite being easily reproducible, the fact that the hugging left method works at all was an incredible bit of luck. And if Q-Lock had to do things like copy and paste entire chunks of collision when messing with it at all, it's understandable that this didn't get fixed for the remaster. Because, like, what were they gonna do? Grab another piece of collision that has a slight ramp shape to it and move it to the exact right spot? Good luck finding the right piece that doesn't also have a bunch of other stuff attached to it. creating new invisible walls and problems when you try adding it here. Fortunately, with thanks to community members like Grimrook, modern modding tools like Soulstruct for Blender make fixing this very easy. Not that I have any idea what I'm doing in here at all, but someone else could probably fix this in under a minute now, which is incredibly cool. Now, there's a few additional sets of invisible walls that try and help you from getting stuck in weird places, but most of the rest are found by the second hollow tree we can enter. While all of these routes surrounding it were either too steep or distant to be able to traverse, they decided to not take any chances and blocked them off anyways. And once inside the tree, the wall along this side is protected, preventing you from getting on top of these mushrooms. When you look at what's below and around them, it's clear it was for your own safety from getting stuck somewhere. The whole area surrounding the Everlasting Dragon is also encircled by a set of invisible walls, from surprisingly far out, too. Once you enter here, you can't fall off into the water and you're completely safe. This was actually somewhat of an annoyance to me. Granted, this was for an extremely niche use case, but I was trying to create vagrants down here on purpose, which involved duping Firekeeper souls to get enough humanity, and then dying twice to lose my bloodstain. I was under the impression that there were some cliffs near this bonfire, so it would be easy to do quickly, but then I found myself having to run a surprising distance before that was possible. Something else I found interesting is how a giant enemy wall was put down here. I think it's somewhat redundant, as the nearest man-eater shell has a leash point that's further out, so it wasn't going to follow you all the way over here anyways. But a bit of redundancy doesn't hurt, especially considering that the people making the maps probably aren't clued in on every detail of enemy AI that gets tweaked by other developers. When they put this wall up, they might have had no idea at all what may or may not be able to follow you here, and just wanted to ensure that this area felt like a safe haven. Or here's some wild speculation, but looking at the sheer size and the location of this thing, maybe it wasn't for keeping other enemies out. Maybe it was to keep the Everlasting Dragon in. It does have some clumsy, unused attack animations, so being able to aggro it might have been a consideration earlier in development. Moving on to the Darkroot Garden and Basin, there's surprisingly little to look at here. The area overall tends to be quite open with very few invisible walls included, and I think it would have been ideal to restrict things a bit more. There's a spot in the forest area where you can survive dropping down into the Darkroot Basin. While this is really cool, and I like that the interwoven map design allows for moments like this can be really annoying while playing online, bearing in mind that this was a hotspot for multiplayer activity, especially back in the day. You run into the exact same problems here when someone does the lower Undead Burg skip during multiplayer. Someone can wind up separated from you, and you'll be stuck on opposite sides of the fog gate. I remember invading someone once, and not being able to find them, and then I was left wondering if they were just extremely well hidden somewhere, or if maybe they jumped down to the basin right when I invaded and I didn't notice their health bar drain. Playing hide and seek within the forest is one thing, but when you expand that possibility to the entire Darkroot Garden and Basin, and then factor in how you can't get back inside the forest if jumping down turned out to be a mistake, that's not great. Or take something that seems more innocuous, like the platform with the giant felines on it. Exploiting how sloped surfaces can give you a big jumping boost, it is possible to get up there. It's a fun thing to mess with during the offline experience, but it can be annoying if you don't know how to get up there and another player does. I saw this happen multiple times back in the day. The one thing of note that they did try to do was protect the interior of Sif's arena. But just like with Quailag's arena, they weren't maybe as aggressive as they could have been, and it still left room for being exploitable to cheese the boss. They also left a gap by the one spot we can get up to, so it doesn't even prevent us from falling out of the map. There's also a spot in the forest where you can get stuck, something that probably should have been covered up like the weird branch spots in the Great Hollow. So yeah, that's my thesis on why the Darkroot Garden is surprisingly light on invisible walls, to a fault. And while I'm not pointing out every area boundary with enemy collision, I think it's worth mentioning how the entrance to the cave leading to the Valley of Drakes has one as well. Because it's so close to an enemy, one who follows you relentlessly even if you rest at a bonfire, it's pretty well known that they get stuck here, and some players will exploit that. On to Sen's Fortress. Right at the start, we have something a bit strange here. We have these invisible walls that surround the first half of the walkway from the Undead Parish. At first glance, it could be mistaken for the usual sort of railing protection we often find, but they're actually set back a bit. They don't do anything to stop you from jumping over the railing. Instead, they mark the tree line. So it's kind of like a stand-in for the trees themselves not having any collision. Understandably, the devs might not have wanted you to be able to jump too far into these trees, but none of this is survivable regardless, and in the end, I don't think it really makes a difference if you fall from here, or if you fall from here. But aside from this is another location that's very light on invisible walls overall. This mostly works out very well here though, because without lots of tricky sources of geometry like branches and roots, the blockier architecture and open spaces means the developers didn't really have to touch up a lot with special considerations. The progression of the level also factors into this. There aren't any shortcuts that need to be protected from happening, because who cares if you're able to jump back down to somewhere kind of weird? You have to travel upwards to beat the level, and there isn't anywhere where an invisible wall is needed to help funnel you into doing that correctly. But if you want to travel back down quickly, not only do we have stuff like these drop-down paths, but they also made the top of this beam an invasion spawn location. And you can also even get here on foot if you drop from here. This was always meant to be a level where, even without using the shortcut elevator, you could get from the top to the bottom easily. So the overall design just lends itself to being an open space where, who cares where you jump? If you survive, you survive. If you don't, you don't. This general openness means you can sometimes jump to some pretty obscure places, or use some unusual paths that the developers might not have even thought of, but it never really hurts anything. Take this walkway to the tower where you can summon Tarkus. If from here, you decided you wanted to suddenly pay Prince Ricard a visit, you could jump down here. It's perfectly survivable. Or if you're completely out of your mind, you could even do this. One consideration that's neat to see is how they handled these hanging cages where you find Logan. They included these little invisible platforms for some extra safety getting in and out of them. They did forget to include one for this cage here, but getting in and out is still safe, so it feels like a precaution more than a necessity. There are just 2 more sets of regular invisible walls in Sense Fortress that I could find. The Firebomb Giant has an invisible wall blocking the Iron Golem's arena, which makes sense. If you could find a way over this ledge and land far enough away from the fog gate, the fight wouldn't initialize correctly. He'd be standing still and unable to take damage. The second is the staircase below Ricard. They put this here because there's an out-of-bounds area nearby and below that isn't protected by a kill box, at least not from around here. So this is the one other part of the level where they were concerned about jumping off of ledges. Though there being collision in this out-of-bounds area is a bit of a problem. There's a pretty notorious glitch where the Iron Golem can knock you out of the arena and cause your bloodstain to get stuck down there, becoming irretrievable. This shouldn't normally be possible though, and I don't know if it's ever been ironed out 100% why this can sometimes happen. I do have a hypothesis, but if you have footage of that happening to you or someone you know, please link me to it. I'd like to take a closer look at it. While we're talking about the Iron Golem, here's something you probably didn't expect. His arena is also protected with enemy walls. It even includes these little horizontal squares to cover these corner gaps. I know what a lot of you are already thinking. It's common knowledge that knocking him out of the arena is a way to defeat him. But the way this works is that the particular animation of him being knocked down is what's granted permission to pass through that collision. Otherwise, he is protected in here. If you take control of him, you wouldn't be able to just walk or jump off of here. One funny quirk to this set of walls though is that sometimes when knocking him off, it can result in the game trying to put him on top of it for a moment. I wasn't previously familiar with this, but thanks to McDan for letting me know and submitting this footage. The Firebomb and Boulder Giants were also given the same protection. It turns out that, without these here, the Firebomb Giant could fall off when doing their frenzy attack. And the Boulder Giant could just walk off. I like how they also plugged up the boulder hole, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the giant to fall down there even when I modded the collision to be removed, sadly. But then I noticed that the Portcullis Giant didn't get the same invisible walls. And if you're sensing a pattern here, you've probably guessed it. Whenever From Software forgets to put an invisible wall where they probably should, there's a good chance for some silly hijinks. This is pretty hilarious, and I had no idea this was possible. Did you know this was possible? I'm wondering if this is a new discovery, but I feel like this has to have happened to someone before and I just somehow never heard about it. It's not even that hard to do. You just need to get him to aim his frenzy attack at the edge of the roof from close to it. From here, he de-renders due to winding up too far away in the level, so we can't be sure of his fate at this point. I found that sometimes he survives, sometimes he doesn't. If he doesn't survive, we'll see his death animation as we approach. If not, his AI will be busted, not knowing how to fight anymore since he becomes focused only on trying to get back to his starting location, which isn't going to work out. I don't know how many people can say that they've finished him off with the arrow trap, but I figured, why not? And maybe something to try for yourself the next time you're in Sun's Fortress. While I wasn't planning on looking at too many of the cutscene or connection collision planes, Anor Londo starts off with an absolute banger. There's a plane of collision floating just above the entrance to Anor Londo, where if you can fly up to it to touch it, it'll swap the skybox out with the one from earlier in the game, and the result is stunning. The golden and grey sky is replaced with a vibrant blue, and we're given a much more diverse color palette. And sun rays with a stronger effect shine down on the city of Anor Londo. I think some people are going to prefer the blue skybox, but it's really not what they were going for aesthetically, and it does have some drawbacks, like how the view of the Duke's Archives from here is darker and harder to see the details on. Though it is gorgeous in its own way, and you can imagine my surprise when I flew up to the collision thinking, what's this gonna do? Most of the time it unloads parts of the map in a way that's a visual mess, but here the game managed to become prettier for a moment. I was not expecting that. At the start of the level, we also find the usual staircase protection that we've come to expect by now. There's nearby out-of-bounds geometry that they didn't want you messing around with. And for the exact same reason, the staircase on the opposite side got the same treatment. And while we're over here, I'd like to point out how at the start of this entrance area to the Duke's Archives, we do get these small sets of invisible walls. They wanted to prevent us from getting anywhere weird, but once again, they didn't bother continuing all the way to the building, and this left things open for speedrunners to take advantage. There's a trick here known as the Golden Fog Gate Skip, or GFGS for short, which involves going up here and getting around the fog gate in some convoluted and impressive manner. Here's a demonstration from Regal in one of his speedruns. Of course, I don't really consider something like this a serious oversight, because this is just speedrunners doing what they do best, breaking the game in absurd ways that no average player would ever figure out on their own. But it is funny to me to see how they started off on the right track with these invisible walls, but just didn't follow through. More important than preventing the speedrun trick would have been throwing up more walls that continued along the other side, where its openness also allows you to get out of bounds in a way that's easier to figure out and cause harm to the player. But after a certain point, it's also kind of the player's fault if they keep trying something they're obviously not supposed to do. Up in the rafters, there's some invisible wall stuff happening as well. I'm not going to bother visualizing it because it looks particularly horrible to toggle that display in-game here, but all of these spaces are covered with a completely solid sheet, as they didn't want you to try getting onto that lower beam to try and get to those unreachable side areas. And those unreachable side areas are also completely blocked off. One detail that might not be as obvious is how the tops of all of these columns were covered with invisible ramps as well, so if you try jumping down on top of them, you'll just slide off. They really didn't want you messing around here. Now here's something completely out of left field, where it looks like the developers solved a potential problem in maybe the most roundabout way possible. When you go through the broken window in the main building, it leads to this area with the Dragon Slayer Greatbow, and they did everything they could to prevent you from walking along the set of walls. To start with, while you can often walk on top of the edge of collisions like this, they made the top of the fence slippery. So, maybe we could try jumping to this directly, but they also made this slippery. Then even if you somehow managed to not slide off of this, they put an invisible wall blocking you from getting down to this lower section, which is also slippery, by the way. And this wasn't just how it was constructed by default, because we find that the other structure on the other side, which we would probably expect to be identical due to its symmetrical design, didn't bother doing any of this stuff. And getting over this wall clearly wasn't a concern, because this is already one of the paths that gets you there. The best I can figure out is that if you could get down here, a running jump would allow you to wind up in this out-of-bounds area over here. Which raises the question, why not just skip all of that effort and put a single invisible wall right here instead? Perhaps they felt that sliding off the structure was the better option compared to how hitting a more obvious invisible wall here would feel. So as overboard as this all looks, this might be what Polish looks like, trying to steer players away from getting to weird places without using invisible walls that are easy to notice. But nearby, we can find the opposite of Polish. We have these staircases that are surrounded by railings with an asymmetrical design. One railing is higher than the other. And the staircase on the opposite side has the exact same issue, where the layout is a mirror image. Their low collision apparently didn't account for this asymmetry correctly, and both railings use the collision of the shorter railing. This means that this isn't really here. The true top of this railing is the yellow strip running through the middle. A well-timed drop stab can land us on top of it, which allows us to see ourselves walking through it. Now, because the high hit collision of the railing is still accurate, the inverse kinematics wants to put the character's feet on top of the railing instead, but it's just a little too far away from our feet to work out. But when we walk along it, you can see it kick in for brief moments, making the character pop up and down. Anyways, consider this another place to leave an illusory wall message. That's pretty much it for the rest of the level. One place that's notoriously unprotected is the spiral staircase. They didn't bother with any railing protection here, so if you want to get through this area quickly, a popular shortcut is simply doing this. Then from here, you can easily open up the one-way shortcut door if you don't want to keep doing the same jump every time you're headed to the boss. Though before we move on, we have some enemy walls we can look at. They did everything they could to prevent the gargoyles from falling to their death again, which was a good choice. It'd be annoying if they fell to their death, because this is the second and last chance to get the gargoyle tail axe. What's curious to me, though, is the enemy wall found by the corkscrew elevator. These blue walls almost always have an obvious purpose, but who is this even for? This could be here to prevent the gargoyle from getting stuck between some columns, and that seems like the most likely reason to me, though it does have a leash point preventing it from coming inside altogether, so you've probably never seen anything interact with this. A good vagrant is capable of spawning behind the base of the elevator, so maybe some player at some point has seen it run into one of these walls before disappearing, but it wouldn't be obvious that it got stuck on one. I found that getting the Dark Moonitis down here has some interesting results, which is not easy to do, by the way. While I was expecting her to get stuck trying to attack me through one of these walls, her AI would always find a path around the invisible walls to get to me. I think getting stuck trying to attack through the wall might only be what happens if they don't have any other route. In the painted world, we find that the area to the left of the staircase is closed off, while the right side is wide open. This makes sense, because even though there's nothing to do in the side area and it's relatively pointless, they made it all traversable and mostly gave it proper collision, so there's no reason to keep us out of here. Makes me wonder if they thought about hiding an item over here at some point. Further back here, there's even an invisible wall trying to stop you from getting too far into the weirdness, which really speaks to the intentionality of this area. Though, with enough messing around, it's possible to wind up on the other side of that wall, where things get a bit awkward. But overall, they let you go here because it's a small area that runs along a sheer cliff, a very obvious visual boundary that doesn't require invisible walls. But the same can't be said of the opposite side of the walkway, and pretty much the whole area around the bonfire, which is of course why they blocked all of that off. On top of this rooftop near the beginning of the level, there's this surprising patch of invisible wall floating beyond the corner of the roof. But it makes sense. If we could make this jump, there's not inherently an issue with using this to get down here, as it leads to a normal part of the level. But you could walk along this ledge and try to go over here, and this is just a facade, not a real building you could explore without issues, so keeping you away from it is understandable. If we turn left when walking into Jeremiah's courtyard, we'll find this side area with rocks that are protected with invisible walls, preventing you from trying to get to another out-of-bounds area. The upper part of the tower is completely encircled by an invisible wall as well. And I have to say, if there was one invisible wall I could remove from the game, it'd be this one. I don't understand what purpose it serves. Pretty much the entirety of the tower is surrounded by normal parts of the level, which are completely in bounds. Just let the player fall to their death. Or if they can find some clever way down, let them do that too. There's just two kind of weird spots in question, but they don't justify wrapping the whole tower like this. From here, you could jump to your death. But you wouldn't wind up anywhere weird or glitchy looking in the process, the game would handle this just fine. The game does try to protect the same spot from lower down by extending this wall a little higher than what you can see, but it's not perfect and you can get over that anyways. And getting over it isn't really a problem. Like sure, you'll die, but again that's just kind of expected when you go out of your way to jump out of the map like that. The one potential problem spot is found on the opposite side, where this out-of-bounds platform down here lacks collision and falling through it would look weird. But this area is also protected with an invisible wall from ground level, so you could just extend this wall a lot higher and the problem would be solved. Otherwise, if this tower wasn't wrapped and you used it to get to the annex before getting the annex key, I'd find it pretty cool if the game let you figure out more than one way to get in there. Sure, the annex door would remain locked from the reverse side, but that's actually kind of a bonus. There's more than one way back out of here, and it'd force you to explore and make use of one of these other paths. So, getting into the annex without the key, totally fine and kind of a missed opportunity, actually. But the real reason I wish the tower wasn't wrapped with an invisible wall is this. And now I have some explaining to do. If it's the low collision that blocks our movement and prevents us from jumping out of the tower, and it's the high collision that projectiles interact with, and we can see that the high collision matches the tower just fine, it is wide open, you might be wondering what the hell is going on here. Well, I did leave out one important detail at the beginning of the video. Projectiles hit high collision if the high collision is able to be loaded, and for anything nearby, it basically always is. For anything far enough away in the map, that's a different story. In a similar way to when you look at models from a distance, you'll get these lower poly level of detail versions that look funny, collision is handled similarly. The game doesn't want to think about collisions of higher resolution when you're too far. Why force the game to be cognizant of a whole lot more polygons at once? This was originally a PS3 game, mind you. So when you're using projectiles, if a set of collisions can't load their high collisions, it'll default to using the low collision instead, resulting in shooting this invisible wall that, under normal circumstances, we should be able to shoot through. From down here, we can see the problem visualized. For this building to my left, I can choose to render the low collision, which again is in yellow, or I can choose to render the high collision, which is in green. When I try doing this to the tower from down here, the low collision renders just fine, but I can't get the high collision to load. The game is just not wanting to bother with it from where I'm standing. But when I'm up in the tower and the high collision is working fine again, I can now shoot back out of the tower with no problem. And to prove it's not like a one-way situation or just raw proximity, I can fly back down to pretty much where I just was, but avoid touching the ground to avoid updating which collisions are loaded. Now the game doesn't give me any trouble when trying to shoot the crow demons. From a broader technical standpoint, I don't fault the system for working the way it does, but from a gameplay perspective, this is incredibly lame. Bow users already have to get used to the arrows sometimes getting stuck in unfortunate places. But then you get to a spot that's wide open, where you have a playstyle where you'd like to pick off enemies from a distance, and the game just denies it in a way that's very unsatisfying and feels glitchy. It doubles down on your worst expectations of using the bow. This could have all been avoided if they didn't wrap this tower in an invisible wall that didn't even need to be here. That's why it gets my nomination for the worst invisible wall in the game. Let's talk about the area behind the Undead Dragon. This popular unintended shortcut, where you can get the dragon legs to stand up via a glitch, has some weird collisions when you try dropping back down to the walkway below. This is because the collision of the broken columns extends a lot higher than they should. We can see that the same issue allows the other unintended shortcut as well. To skip the dragon entirely, you can do this, and then you can do this. The reason we can land on this invisible platform in the first place is because, once again, the thicker part of the column below extends higher than it does visually. Now, the bridge is symmetrical, but I've only ever seen people do it from the right side of the bridge. This is probably because the broken railings nearby aren't a perfect mirror image. The one on the right side allows us to drop down straight on top of it more easily, but the one on the left side will pressure players into moving towards the wall with more momentum, in which case you're more likely to bounce off the wall and not make it. But that doesn't mean it's impossible from the left side, it's just harder. There's also a bunch of invisible collision in Priscilla's tower. Floors and stairs that go higher and lower than the boss room. If you'd like to see more about that, check out my Out of Bounds video. The Catacombs is another area that's known for being pretty open overall, with multiple paths to the bottom of the level, including one where they expected you to drop off of a cliff. I wasn't expecting to find many invisible walls, but there were a few considerations put in. The whole waterfall area was protected by a big shell. This is perhaps the most relevant near patches, where the wall prevents you from jumping through here. And it also prevents you from jumping onto these rocks to try anything funny. This is one of those collision sets that was added to the level later on, meaning it's not just tied to this specific map piece, and it belongs to a collection of adjustments that were made to the level in bulk. So what else were they worried about? From the very start of the level, looking off the cliff's edge, we find that they put this here to create a ramp that sticks out much further from the opposite side. I think they didn't want you making this jump, so they used this invisible wall to funnel you into the pit. With the collision removed, it is possible to make and survive this jump. And without the collision, you'd be able to make a drop from the other side as well, though it's a little more difficult than it looks. This does make me wonder if this other shortcut was unintended, then? If they didn't want you to be able to make it down here right at the start of the level, it feels a little inconsistent that you can just do this anyways. Though with the way this particular ledge sticks out, maybe it was considered like a designated potential landing zone and they were more okay with it here. This same set of collision also puts some slanted walls inside Pinwheel's room, trying to avoid any issues from getting on top of the books. And it appears that the entrance to Pinwheel's arena went through a couple stages of trying to fix it up. The map piece itself put a wall on the right side to make sure you dropped into the room correctly, so they were already thinking about potential issues here, but in the set of collisions we were just looking at, they decided to go back and add another wall to the left as well. If we were able to land anywhere on this upper ledge without these walls, we'd be able to skip the fight. In the Tomb of the Giants, I could only find two sets of invisible walls. One that tried to help protect you from getting stuck on the stalagmites in Nito's boss room, which is still possible, but this for sure helped in making the problem a lot less worse than it would have been otherwise, and another to keep you from landing on some objects near the large divine ember. If we include the blue walls that block enemies, then we also have one at the start of the level, another surrounding the short ladder we find shortly before the area where we see light again, and one inside the cave before the area with all the pinwheels. I'll take a closer look at some of these in a second, but it makes sense that the Tomb of the Giants would be very unrestricted overall, for a couple reasons. The whole point is that you can barely see, so part of the potential chaos in playing through this area is that you might suddenly fall to your death, or fall to a location and survive, but have no idea where you are or what to do, so the developers were cool with letting you wind up wherever. Additionally, the level design just doesn't lend itself to there being weird out-of-bounds places you might try and get to, because of the poor visibility. In other levels, it's important to include out-of-bounds areas, so the game space doesn't feel too narrow or constricted. But since you can't see that far in front of you in the Tomb of the Giants, the developers didn't feel the need to include scenery that was only meant to be looked at. You know, aside from the cool distance stuff. Let's take another look at those enemy walls. Finding one at the beginning of the level isn't unexpected at all, they're usually dividing area boundaries. But this did get me thinking about how most area transitions are a lot more bottlenecked than this. When we had something like the Black Knight not being able to follow us into the cave earlier, sure, it looked a bit funny, but I feel like a lot of people could write that off due to being at the entrance of a cave. Something getting stuck in what's essentially a doorway is something we're plenty used to in video games. The plausibility of this is pushed to its limits when this giant skeleton appears to have everything completely wide open in front of it, but it also can't get by. Later in the level, we have this protected ladder. For any enemies that might have fallen down here, I suspect that they were concerned with how enemy pathing wouldn't be able to handle returning de-aggroed enemies back to their starting locations correctly, since none of these enemies can climb ladders. Then we also have this one later in the level. I think it's to stop the giant skeletons from trying to follow you into this cave. They wouldn't really fit through the cave, and so it's better to keep them out rather than allowing them to get in a little too far, where they might get stuck and it could look weird. An unintended side effect, though, is something funny you can do with the skeleton babies. They don't have a leash point that prevents them from following you this far, so you can get a bunch of them chasing after you, and watch this happen. In the Duke's Archives, let's start by taking a closer look at the Duke Skip. For the uninitiated, players who are doing deathless runs, or anyone who just wants to speedrun through the area, may want to skip the first encounter with Seath, which has a guaranteed death and sends you to the prison. Escaping the prison is normally required to complete the Duke's Archives, because this passage connecting the front half and back half of the building doesn't open until you escape the prison. However, just because this is closed off by default, doesn't mean the higher floors are. These are always open. You just can't normally get up to them from down here, which is why the Duke Skip is a thing. I remember trying this back in the day and having trouble pulling it off. When I went to go see why, I found that the railing was a little taller than expected, but not to a significant degree. But then, that also, the archway was covered up and it looked like the area you had to slip through was fairly small. Ah, an explanation for why I was having a hard time. Except, not. In talking with Regal, I found that the smaller space only applied to the bottom floor. The upper floors are wide open, to the point that the walls you do see aren't even here, and your open space to get over the railing is actually this big. So it turns out it's a little easier than I thought it was, and my issue was always rolling too late and aiming for the railing. These areas are fully covered from the side though, which is why everyone is rolling around from an angle in the first place. The staircase on this railing also has some extensions above it. Being able to jump over the railing isn't really a problem, and I'm sure they didn't care if a player did it on purpose. They likely just wanted it to be harder to do by accident, and this helps accomplish that. But since they're not very tall, you can still jump over, which also means that you can get on top of them to see yourself float in the air again. I'm going to mark this as another spot where I'd like to see y'all leave those illusory wall messages. In the prison tower, there's this one column that has a sort of cage around it. It's actually the only spot in here like this. Other similar spots didn't get the cage because they weren't close to anything else that would let you easily jump to them. So this one was blocked off in a way that's represented visually to discourage you from trying, but what's not represented visually is the much larger sheet of invisible wall that's really there. So if you were ever eyeing up this particular corner as somewhere to try and land, they made sure that wasn't an option. The entrance to the Crystal Cave had walls surrounding the entire area to help prevent you from getting out of bounds as well. But what I find interesting is a few specific patches of enemy walls that were put out here as well. They stick out a bit further than the normal invisible walls, so I think they were just trying to prevent the crystal golems from getting stuck in these trees, maybe. And of course we also have the invisible walkways of the Crystal Cave. I was considering skipping this as Zuli the Witch already made a video showing them, and way back I also made an Imager album showing them. But while we're here I might as well, because I also have a few specific things I can point out. This is what the first walkway looks like. At the end, it has this extra little tag sticking out that most people probably don't know about. There's no real purpose to it, just a funny place to stand once you know it's here, I guess. This is what the path to the boss looks like. And this is what the path to the blue Titanite slab looks like. While the other ones are simple straight lines, they went out of their way to make this one a lot more confusing and difficult to navigate, with changing inclinations and sudden turns. The biggest troll is this dead end that's sticking out, where it can throw you off, and now you have no idea where you're supposed to go. This dead end was also used as a spawn location for evil vagrants, so to add insult to injury, players who lose their bloodstains down here, most likely in the process of trying to get the blue slab, may spawn this monster out here for other players, making things even harder. In the new Londo Ruins map, we have this funny set of invisible enemy walls for the Valley of Drakes. Anyone who's ever farmed the Drakes before has experienced them falling off, so this clearly didn't help much. But similar to how the Iron Golem can't just walk off the ledge, neither can the Drakes, so it appears that the developers were perfectly okay with their flying attack causing them to go over. I also like being able to use the collision to visualize the actual size and boundaries of the abyss. It's really hard to orient ourselves in here normally, but from this vantage point we can see how everything is laid out. Here the player is standing precisely where they land, and they're also facing the direction they'd be facing if they walked straight forward from the fog gate. Here's the four kings' spawn locations, and the order that they spawn in. The bonfire that spawns after the fight is over happens to be right next to the player, exactly where we land, and of course, here's Koth. We can also just barely see the out-of-bounds Master King below, whose health bar is the one we actually see during the fight, where all the other kings act as a damage conduit for this one we can't normally see. Otherwise, New Londo Ruins lacks invisible walls to a fault, having issues here stemming from their absence that are perhaps more severe than in any other area. There are places where you can jump out of bounds, and you'll pass through a death cam plane, which is seen here as these large white sheets. It's a piece of collision that tells the camera to look down from above when you fall to your death. But something to understand about the death cam is that it's tied to its own sheet of collision. It's not what kills you. There's a couple other kinds of collisions responsible for that, and here we can see it visualized in black, which is placed lower than the death cam planes. What this means is that if you can find out-of-bounds parts of the map that have collision to stand on, and they're below the white sheets but above the black ones, that you'll survive landing there, but the game will switch to the overhead death cam while you remain alive. From there, the game switches to something almost like tank controls, and moving your character around with intent becomes a bit of a nightmare. However, you can quit and reload to get normal control of your character back, free to explore whatever parts of the out-of-bounds areas that actually have collision. While one solution would have been to make sure the out-of-bounds areas lacked collision to stand on, that way you could just fall through whatever you see here and pass through the kill plane regardless, the other would have been to wall them off with invisible walls, so you couldn't make the jumps to them. There are several places where you can make these kinds of jumps. You can do it from behind the illusory wall. You can do it from this corner behind the pool. You can do it from earlier in the level, near the path to the Firekeeper Soul. And you can do it by the start of the level, landing on the bottom segment of the staircase by Ricker of Vinheim. Here's a brief tour through Out of Bounds New Londo. There's also a ridiculous speedrunning trick you can do to get down into Quelaag's domain by falling out of the map in the right place. In collaboration with Phobia, I showed how to do this in a recent video of his called Glitches You Can Do in Dark Souls Prepare to Die Edition. You'll find a link to that in the video description, go give it a watch. In the Demon Ruins, we have this invisible wall right behind us at the entrance. It's here to help prevent us from getting up this hill. If it wasn't here, we'd find a pretty large out-of-bounds area we could explore. The collision doesn't keep going forever, so there are places where it dead ends and you'll just fall through the map, but there's a lot more solid ground than I was expecting. There's even a path that gets you back to the exterior of the bell tower. Although you can tell that they really didn't want you to come here, as they went out of their way to make everything near to it very slippery. Even parts of the ground that aren't that steep will just basically throw you off the nearby cliff. By the entrance to Ceaseless, we have this wall blocking you from trying to get to another out-of-bounds location behind it. So that explains why you couldn't get back there, Fino. The entrance itself is flanked by invisible walls as well, probably trying to avoid having you being able to get inside without passing through the fog gate. Or perhaps it was to help prevent escaping. And the bridge to Ceaseless has these sloped planes on both sides of it, to keep you from landing somewhere on the side, where it does have some parts that are a bit wider and flat. Inside the Ceaseless Arena, pretty much every column or pile of rubble along a wall is protected with much larger invisible walls behind them. And the spot where you pick up the gold hem set was made into a more narrow corridor than might be initially obvious. I was a little surprised to not find any enemy walls keeping Ceaseless trapped in his arena, though I suppose it makes sense. With no way to lure him towards any other cliff, nothing in his pathing would cause him to go there. And the one cliff we can lure him to apparently wasn't really at risk for having him fall off incorrectly. If he doesn't detach his arm, which starts off fused to his body and is normally required to allow his falling death, he spams his Fire Blast attack instead of going all the way to the cliff's edge. So the devs were relying on his behavior to keep him from falling off of the cliff, which seems like a bit of a gamble to me. That's why I'm surprised that there weren't also walls for some redundancy. But I've never heard about him falling off of here in an incorrect way, so it seems to have worked out just fine. When his arm is detached and the falling death is possible, simply walking near the cliff's edge automates his death jump of desperation. Even when we take control of Ceaseless, walking to that spot forces the jump to happen. I didn't press jump or choose to make it happen, it's just guaranteed at this point. Once the lava drains, there's a couple odd sets of walls down here whose purpose I don't really understand. If I make myself invincible to ignore the death planes, it seems like maybe it was to funnel us down here in such a way that we have solid ground to land on that isn't awkward. This invisible wall was probably part of an earlier attempt to tidy up how dying looked when you landed below, but it was rendered redundant and unnecessary with the inclusion of the black death plane, which kills us instantly when passing through. A possible remnant of a problem from earlier in development that wound up being solved in a different way. Then we also have whatever this is over here. This one feels completely random to me. Maybe there was some issue with hugging the wall too closely in this one spot, but in deleting it and messing around, I couldn't figure out what it accomplishes. Along the Capra Demon platform, all of these open segments are walled off. The Dormant Centipede Demon is also completely blocked off, preventing you from trying to get on top of it, and ramps below funnel you away from any parts you might get stuck on. The walls surrounding the Centipede Demon have a pretty surprising result in that you couldn't walk off to your death by this item even if you wanted to. The staircase here has some really tall railing protection, but the ends weren't properly closed off. This means that, from above, you could jump in between them. I figured this would mean that you'd be stuck here, but you can do a ridiculous series of jumps to get back out. By the large flame ember, we have a wall blocking off this area behind it. Invisible walls below also prevent trying to get behind these columns, though you would have already passed through a kill plane trying to get there. Throughout the rest of the level, we find invisible walls blocking off areas that get dense with branches, including the Bed of Chaos itself. And then pretty much all of the area around the entrance to the Bed of Chaos is carefully wrapped with invisible walls as well. In a few places they're easy to find, which can be a little annoying, but you're better off not getting stuck somewhere. Closing off all this out-of-bounds stuff feels like something they probably would have also done in New Londo Ruins with more development time. In the shortcut path, we find these extra flaps outside the end of the bridge to try and prevent you from getting down to somewhere like here. There's also a blue enemy wall dividing the demon ruins from Lost Izalith, but they're technically the same map, so there wouldn't have been issues with enemies in this area crossing this boundary. It could still make sense that they just didn't want anything trying to follow you through, but once you know it's here, it's a little funny seeing Solaire get tripped up on it. Moving on to the DLC. The opening corridor is lined with some root protection, along with a few similar spots scattered around the periphery of the Sanctuary Guardian's arena. Inside the Sanctuary, we find various problem spots cordoned off as well, although this particular set of statues maybe had its invisible wall stick out a little too far. On the bridge leading to the Royal Wood, we find more railing protection, and this gets a bit strange as well. It's a reconstruction of the bridge leading to Sif in the past, and that bridge didn't bother with this. It all feels a little pointless, and I couldn't find anything wrong with walking on the railing after deleting the collision. Because you can jump over it in this corner, I thought about trying to walk along it with the collision remaining, but my jumps resulted in rolling over it. And while you can quit and reload to wind up back on top of the collision you touched most recently, and that works for getting back on top of other railings, I figured the teeny amount of time you have after rolling off and before landing on the bridge was probably too small of a window for quitting out of the game. And this is why I'm not a speedrunner. Here's more footage from Regal. He knew of this spot already and was able to pull off that fast quit out. But the problem is, when you reload here, it glitches into something almost like a first-person view, with your character invisible, similar to earlier, and you can't move or even look around at all. Thankfully, this doesn't completely ruin your save file, as just like when you fall for too long, a 30-second timer will eventually get you out of here. Over by the corner that would have the staircase back out of the forest if this was Darkroot in the past, the geometry of the environment extends out further than we can see, blocking this platform should we be tempted to try and jump to it. The staircase by the Ulisil Township bonfire has a bit of extra protection that wraps around this corner, in an attempt to prevent you from getting down here. This out-of-bounds area below lacks collision, so of course they didn't want you messing around with it. However, Regal demonstrates for us how the half-hearted attempt to not protect the rest of the railing allows for this. Jumping out of bounds to collide with the Battle of Stoicism, which puts the purple Coward's Crystal into your inventory if you're playing the Prepare to Die edition. This works because these PvP arenas are locations that we normally warp to, but their physical location on the map just happens to be down there. Over by the top of the shortcut elevator, a set of walls protects you from going over the ledge here, probably because of these steps nearby. But they also put up this wall here, and even covered this little ledge with a ramp that you slide off of to prevent easily walking towards it. Much of the outer walls of the Chasm of the Abyss are covered with sets of invisible walls to protect you from winding up stuck in stalagmites. But my favorite consideration here was this little box they put under the end of the bridge to Manus, to prevent getting stuck when trying to get this item. And lastly, here's a quick look at the arena for Manus. The whole thing has tall walls surrounding it, but even if you could get out of bounds, for some reason there's a pretty wide ring running around it that you'd be able to walk on. Okay, onto the final area. By the Firelink altar, the room is wrapped with these invisible walls to keep you away from the distant scenery. If you ever tried to make this jump, it was never going to work out. Plus, there's nothing to stand on back there anyways. In the space that I like to call the Heavenly Corridor, 2 extra strips of invisible collision run parallel to the main staircase. These are used by the ghosts of the Black Knights to loop their walking animation through here, by teleporting them from one back to the other. Sadly, it doesn't also teleport us, but if we could reach it, we could stand on it. The entire starting area of the Kiln has massive walls that prevent us from exploring too far out into the Ashen Dunes. Although if you ever tried to go back there, it's fairly unlikely that you even reached one of these walls, as the environment already has steep and slippery surfaces that do a pretty good job of keeping you away. There's probably somewhere you can get up to them, but I couldn't find it. And pretty much the entire staircase to Gwyn is enclosed as well. I don't think I knew that you couldn't jump to your death in spots like this. The only spot where it's open is over here, where it telegraphs its openness much more clearly, and it also does this once more at the end. Here I was surprised to find that this invisible wall didn't stick out a little further to prevent us from trying to jump down there, but surely it's covered with a death plane, right? No, wait, the death plane is lower than that? Okay, but maybe it doesn't have collision. No, it does have collision. That can only mean... Huh. I didn't know you could go there. Anyways, the most important reason for the staircase being protected isn't for stopping you from falling off, but it's to prevent you from getting on top of the railing. When we remember that high collision is what stops our projectiles, and high collision usually matches what we see, this means that we'd theoretically be free to snipe Gwyn from a distance, and that's exactly the case. If we could have gotten a little bit higher here, this would have worked. That's not to say that there isn't other cheese potential. From inside his arena, as you'd expect by now, we find some invisible walls that block off some of the periphery, but they didn't block this area off. If you enjoyed this video, thanks so much for watching. Again, if there's any collision weirdness you were wondering about but I didn't cover it, let me know in the comments below and I'll be happy to provide more screenshots or context. If you'd like to support this channel, please consider doing all of the stuff on YouTube that helps. It really makes a difference. You can also support me directly on Patreon. That's patreon.com/illusorywall. I'd like to thank Grimrook, TKGP, Dropoff, King Boar, Horcrux, and Twisted Gwazi for additional insight into map data and collision stuff, either helping directly with this video or just in general over the years. And also Regal for his perspective and assistance in speedrunning stuff, and McDan and Rowe for multiplayer assistance. And of course, an extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier: Basileus, Europa, Gary Marshall, Incia Radable, Jack Gerhardt, Kakuruma, Carl Germ, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Matt, Nashwan Azari, Nate Hines, Ronax, The Majalis Duo, and Zelther. Thanks for watching and have a great day.